to the Mixing Music Podcast. I'm your host, Dee Kei, and with me, as always, is my lovely co-host, the Glue Lu.
Let me bring that mix together.
Yes, and today we have an episode. Well, we were trying to do a read the manual episode about the SSL G-Bus, which turned out to be one of the worst Google search queries we've ever ran. And there's nothing really came up because I guess it's so simple. And no blogs, not even Wikipedia, had a good description of what it does. I mean, we all know the VCA, the famous VCA compressor, the SSL bus compressor is crazy simple. It's really simple. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about how we like to use VCA compressors, the various different types that we've used. We'll go into, obviously we'll talk about what a VCA compressor is. And then I found one blog that specifically, in more technical terms, talks about what a VCA compressor is, or what a VCA is, and how the detection and versus gain reduction circuit works. And I'm going to read more about what a VCA compressor actually does on the inside. What does it mean? A voltage controlled amplifier. Does it alter its gain? So we're gonna talk about that as I read a blog on what the heck a VCA is to begin with. But first off, Lou, what are things that you like to use a VCA compressor?
Hands down, one of my favorite things is drums. Honestly speaking, like a drum bus with a good VCA, you can really make that snare crack or tuck into its pocket. They're pretty damn clean, and using it for like parallels is also really nice. Although I have been using more Veramuse for parallel lately, but VCAs are typically like my go-to for drum buses.
Yeah, VCA is VCA type compression is notorious for being very controllable. Right. I mean, you look at the SSL type stuff, there's a wide range of pretty fast attack times, not hyper fast like the 1176, but fast attack times to really slow attack times. Yeah. Same with releases, and oftentimes modern day bus compressors, VCA bus type compressors have built-in sidechain, high pass filter sidechain in the actual unit itself, which makes it really easy to use. Yeah, drums are really good for it. Mixed bus in general. Some crazy statistic like 86% of hit records go through an SSL. I thought I saw that on a bus somewhere, but now I'm thinking about it. I'm like, how the heck do they measure that?
Yeah, where is this metric?
Yeah, what does this metric mean? 86% of which records? What is the
like? What was the sample size?
Yeah. Of the current top 40, I guess. I don't know. I have no idea. Anyway, SSL is one of the most famous ones. We also got API. We got Dangerous. We got even Overstayer. What else do we have? We have Vertigo has a VCA type compressor. The Obsidian from Dramastic Audio or whatever it is. There's a bunch, and they're mostly all, to a certain degree, kind of like SSL clones. Like, I don't know if SSL was the one who did it first, but
I think that they just did it most iconically. Like the SSL E and C series consoles were like some of the most sought after consoles for mixing for the longest. And the G was considered to be the most like musical of the two, while the E was considered a little more precise. But because of that, you hear a lot about the G bus. So I think it's just a fact of popularity. Like if you had a SSL studio, you had an SSL G bus or whatever bus compressor was on the board. So much so that it's part of their marketing even now. If you buy a smaller console, typically it will come with some sort of bus compression, like the SSL XL desk comes with the G bus 500 series. If you get the Matrix, it doesn't come with it because that's part of its gimmick. It doesn't do that. But if you get even like the legacy consoles or even the AWS like baby size like 16 channel ones, like it still comes with a bus compressor.
Absolutely. Okay, I found this website. The VCA compressor was developed by David Blackmer in a period that went from 1970 to 1973. That's interesting. It wasn't that long ago. Well, I guess that is 50 years ago, but the first applications of this technology succeeded in several areas, such as transient restore, noise reduction systems, subharmonic synthesizers, other than obviously the compressor itself. All those applications were well represented in the product by Blackmer's design, the DBX. So it sounds like DBX was the first people to use VCA. But that being said, it sounds like they use it for a lot more than just compression.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, DBX does have noise reduction, subsynths, right? The subharmonic synthesizers. I didn't realize that the VCA went into that too.
Well,
but
that actually makes sense. Now, I never thought about connecting the two whenever I heard about, control the VCA on this synth or that synth. I never connected to if that is in fact what's connected.
yeah, I didn't know DBX was the first to make it, but I mean, SSL is obviously like one of the most popular, famous ones to ever utilize it.
Would that have been the 160 VU, or what model would that have been?
I have no idea. It doesn't say which.
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, which unit was the first one necessarily, but there are mentions of SSL. First VCAs were made by discrete components in specific housing. The first DBX compressors, but also for instance SSL, were realized in this way. Later on, the circuit was implemented with integrated circuits. Okay, that made no sense. Okay. Anyway, let's talk about the SSL, which is one of the most famous. I mean, we also got a bunch more. Smart Research has a bunch as well. I also like to use VCA compressors for, my goodness, I use it all the time. I have 3 in my desk right now that I'm looking at. And they all sound really different. I wonder why VCA compressors sound so different too. I wonder if it has anything to do with if it's the transformers on the output or the lack of. But I find that as simple as VCA compressors are supposed to be, each one sounds wildly different, even with the same exact settings. I have and quite often use the Warm Audio bus comp for various different duties, most likely instrumental bus, drums quite often as well. I can tell you what I don't use it on. I typically don't use VCA on horns. I don't use VCA on strings. I typically don't use VCA on the voice, although I assume it would sound good. But yeah, I mostly use it on bus or groupings rather than individual instruments.
Yeah, it's always been described as a good form of glue because it's pretty clean across the board. They do all, like you said, have different tones, but the one major characteristic that they always have is like this sense of like, oh, it's pretty easy to glue things without having to do a dramatic amount of compression. And if you do a dramatic amount of compression, it doesn't break apart and completely distort out like other compressors.
That's true. It's faster than Varimu or any kind of tube or opto, and there's a lot more control than any type of opto. Because, I mean, from what I understand, an opto compressor totally depends. The attack and release time totally depends on the opto cell.
Yeah.
So even if you have 2 of the same exact units, unless it's highly tested in the labs, like it's very difficult to have them precisionally matched.
Do you remember that
stereo work?
Did you remember that they actually made like a stereo LA2A rack unit from UA?
No, I don't.
So you know how they make the 2610, the 276, and things of that nature, where it's just 2 modules next to each other? Well, they took the LA2A with its T4 cell and all, and they compacted it into one side, and then they made a second channel, and they just called it a stereo unit. So for a little bit, there was actually a very small swing where they made stereo units, but the main complaint from the manufacturing side was that they couldn't actually perfectly match them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And then on the opposite hand, a VCA compressor is very easy to match and it's very easy to control. That's cool. Let's go talk about what a VCA compressor is. So this is for the nerds. This episode is for the nerds out there, but I'm just going to start reading this and kind of pick and choose the most important parts of this article. A VCA compressor, as the name would suggest, is a compressor that utilizes a VCA or a voltage-controlled amplifier within its gain reduction circuit. The first question that comes to mind about when learning about VCA compressors is something along the lines of, if a compressor needs to attenuate signal level in order to reduce dynamic range, then why is a voltage control amplifier used? Well, yeah, so let me keep going here. In order to fully understand VCA compressors, let's define VCAs in more detail. What is a voltage-controlled amplifier? A VCA is an amplifier that alters its gain applied to an input or carrier signal in proportion to a control voltage or modulator signal, hence the name. VCAs can be used to amplify, attenuate, or otherwise control the amplitude of the input/carrier signal. So the VCAs will be involved with three signals. They are, one, the carrier. This is the input AC signal, or the audio signal, which is generally bipolar, having negative and positive amplitudes. We see the waveform that goes up and down, right? It is a signal that becomes altered by the VCA itself. The modulator. This is the control voltage input, which is the VCA compressor is unipolar, having only positive amplitude. That is the signal that effectively alters the audio signal carrier. So basically, the carrier is the input source, and the modulator is the detection circuit, oftentimes called the sidechain as well. Output, the instantaneous product of the carrier and modulator, as long as the modulator is positive. Oh my goodness, this is about to get more confusing, isn't it? I'm going to keep trying to simplify this as much as possible, but this is beyond. I'm not going to pretend like this is easy to understand. The word amplifier in terms of voltage-controlled amplifier is misleading. The majority of VCA circuits do not exceed a gain ratio of 1, meaning that VCAs actually attenuate rather than amplify the signals. Yeah, we got that. They attenuate, meaning they lower the volume. So VCA works like this. The stronger the control or voltage modulator or the detection circuit, the highest the amplitude, the more carrier signal is passed through the input. This means a few things. At some control voltage modulator level, the full carrier signal level is passed through the output. When the control voltage voltage modulator level is 0 or negative, no carrier signal is passed through to the output. Okay, at all the other points between 0 and full, the modulator will have the effect of attenuating the carrier between the input and output of the VCA. And there's a little visualization. This is becoming really, really difficult, but let's talk about, I'm going to skip through here. In order to have a continuous output signal without any flat lines or zero amplitude relative to the input signal, the modulator must be unipolar. This requires a sort of RMS, root mean square, detector and rectifier that will effectively read the average amplitude of the input signal and output varying a DC voltage that will always be positive. Okay, so VCA compressors are set to be RMS. Which is more of the average rather than peaks.
Which makes sense why they wouldn't be as reactive. Like if it's an RMS, then it's only compressing based on averages versus
actual peaks.
Yeah.
Like transient peaks. Okay.
So that would make it smoother.
Different VCA compressors are designed differently. However, the main idea is that the detected DC voltage will effectively lower the modulator signal level to attenuate the carrier. So the detector path will manipulate the modulator signal to achieve the typical compressor parameters. These parameters include the following: threshold, ratio, attack, release, and knee. Okay, do we need to get into that? Threshold, the amplitude limit that dictates when the compressor will engage and disengage. The ratio of the input signal amplitude above the set threshold and the output signal amplitude above the threshold. I don't know if there's a more difficult or confusing, more technical way to describe these. This is a very technical article that is honestly beyond my understanding. Very, very much written by a much smarter man than I. Okay, but let's get into the characteristics of VCA compressor. So VCA compressors are awesome because they are very low in distortion. They're very clean. That's something that we've talked about. They have a very flexible threshold, ratio, attack, and release, and sometimes even knee controls. They're very capable of very fast attack and release times. They have a very transparent sound, which is the same exact thing of very low distortion. I guess less colored. Capable of high levels of gain reduction. That's true.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm looking at these VCA compressors here. Even on the gain reduction meter, I'm seeing 20 dBs, and I've seen them go more too.
Yeah, that's kind of the reason why I like them on drums, because you can push them a little more. So like if you wanted it to snap and pop, like I love getting a good snare crack, right? And VCA compressors on a drum bus can help with that. but you can do a lot of compression before it starts like really destroying what source you're on.
There you go. Yeah. Well, you could compress and destroy it in a good way.
Yeah,
as
you can.
well.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Typically less expensive than the delta mu or tube, vari mu, and optical compressors. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So they're a lot less expensive, which would make sense as to why they'd push to be so popular. If you can get a better sound or just as good of a sound, more control with less expensive. That's how good VCA compressors are. I'm thinking like just because it's easier. This industry, this industry is not famous for adapting quickly to things that are easier.
No. Now, do you see the technology we're still using to this day? Like I found the dual LA2A thing.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, they were extremely short run. Like as soon as they announced it, they also announced its discontinuation. But it's a very rare piece if you find them.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, UA has done a few of those. Okay. And then lastly, this is really interesting. I've never thought of this. I've never seen anybody describe VCA compressor like this, but it says may lack high-end clarity.
I could see that.
It may lack high-end clarity. I don't quite understand.
So they're very fast, and because of that, I can imagine that maybe the way it responds, it kind of chips away at some of the detail.
Yeah, I mean, like, how can you say that it's so clean? In a list of words to describe a compressor, you say that it has very little distortion, especially compared to other compressor types. It's very clean.
But the
last thing is like, and then the top end is, What is that? What does that mean? May lack high-end clarity.
Maybe the idea of clean is smooth.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what it means.
Because does it ever use the descriptor of transparent?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, there is a reason why each VCA compressor sounds slightly different. Now I'm going to be paying attention to the top end.
I forgot the Shadow Hills was a VCA.
Yeah, we're looking through different compressors that are.
I actually did like my Shadow, but that actually the descriptor you just gave about like the top end not being so clean actually makes sense with that Shadow Hills, because I always mentioned that it made things just a little bit darker, so it worked well for like really bright tracks. And you wouldn't have to do anything. It just running straight through it made it darker.
Yeah. This website is actually really incredible, and they have a bunch of other things too. So shout out to mynewmicrophone.com. That's mynewmicrophone.com.
That is a mouthful, but it's a good website name.
Holy cow, dude. There's a lot of other topics that you can read about, including peak metering compression, RMS metering compression, feedback compression, feed forward compression, upward limiting. There's a lot of different things, but let's read this last paragraph here. Should compression be used on every track? As general rule, compression should be used with intent. We talk about that every single
all
time.
The time. Literally just talked about that with the client where he had brought up, he's had songs mixed by Chris Lord-Alge and everybody. And he's like, and one of the challenges he's going through is he said he was mixing a song, put plugins on almost every track and everything. He thought he found like the sweet spot and everything. Then he decided to bypass everything. It was like the song sounds better.
Yeah, or I mean, bypassed. even the clear-headedness to try it and to understand that it does, be open-minded enough to realize that it sounds better without everything. Because I feel like most people get stuck and they're like for sure certain. So even if most of them won't decide to bypass, but even if they do, they still can't hear that. There's no way that without everything on sounds better.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's awesome. But and therefore only be used on every track in the case that every track would require it. So let's talk about when is compression required.
Really high ranges of, really high dynamic range.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. I mean, it's a really practical tool. It's supposed to make things easier to listen to.
Yeah, like if you think about like drums, I'm sure you already know, like anybody can play quietly, and some people can at some point just give you a nice big rim shot on that snare. And that's just
spike everything.
Yeah, exactly. Compression can actually help you keep everything in a pocket so that you can listen to the performance without it really spiking through your headphones.
Yeah, it is a really practical tool, right?
Yeah.
Like we don't have to turn up and down the volume in the car.
Yeah.
This is like a real thing. Classical music does this all the time because there's significantly less compression on classical music. But you hear the beginning, the intro sometimes is very quiet. And then all of a sudden towards the end or in the middle, it gets very large and very big. And the dynamic range is so large and so different between the quietest part and the loudest part that you might have to turn up and down the volume in the song, which to a regular consumer in a car setting is fucking annoying and difficult to listen to. In fact, statistics show that if in a podcast that is poorly mixed, that you have to turn up and down the volume in order to hear the different guests at the same volume. So like the talking voices between the hosts are really different. Statistically, nobody's going to listen to that episode.
Yeah.
Like
to
if
be
they
honest,
have to change
I'm
the
that
volume.
way with YouTube. Like if you have a YouTube channel and the video is very quiet, it's already kind of like, damn, I really don't like turning my speakers up because I don't want to get surprised by the next track, so I'll just move on to the next thing. Yeah,
which is true.
Yeah.
This is a real thing. And that's not coming from us being engineers. Like that's a regular consumer statistic. So compressors are really useful. Yeah. They're really useful. But it is often overused. I mean, one of the side effects of compression is that slamming thing that we're talking about with drums. You bring out the rooms, you bring out the sustain of the room. You can really tame and squash the transient, which makes the snare sound harder, fatter. But anyway, there's some other color things that make compression sound great beyond the practical use. But anyway, more often than not, there will be certain tracks in a mix that should sound perfectly fine and better without dynamic range compression. Once again, the typical benefits of using compression on a track include, but are not limited to, the following. Maintaining a more consistent level across the entirety of the audio signal or track. Now, that's one of the secrets to getting loud as well. And there's different types of ways to control the volume. Compression is just one of them, but you also got like saturation
for one.
Automation, there you go, literally. Yeah. Automation, you got saturation as well, any sort of like clipping. Yeah. Right? Distortion.
Actually, I like clipping, and sometimes I like overdoing the clipper. Like, I like the way some of them break up.
Yeah, and each of them break up slightly differently. Yeah, they break up slightly differently. So, clipping is awesome. All right, preventing overloading and clipping. That's what I'm reading again from the list. The benefits of using compression is to prevent clipping, even though we just talked about how we like it.
It's so good.
Yeah, side chaining elements together, enhancing sustain, enhancing transients. It's interesting. One of the pieces of equipment, the VCA compressors that I have in my desk right now, is the Tegler Audio Magnetismus 2. And they call it on their website a transient designer. You were asking me about it. It's literally a VCA compressor that feeds into a tape emulated saturation circuit. So what it does is that the compression, if you're supposed to hyper compress it, so it really kicks that initial transient through, and you can change the attack and release time. And then you can round out that created transient with the saturation circuit.
Nice.
So you kind of got this like boosted hyper sharp transient from the compressor unit with hyper compression and good amounts of makeup gain. And then you have saturation, which rounds out that initial peak a little bit more. So they call it their version of a transient designer. So transient control. So you can create sustain, you can control or enhance transients with the compressor if used correctly. You can add, quote, movement to a signal.
Yeah.
That's interesting. What do you think it means to add movement? I'm thinking right now, I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
In mastering, sometimes you're asked to maintain a groove, right? So sometimes you're actually listening to the compression and seeing how it actually affects like the rhythmic pattern. Because sometimes compression can take down a kick that is kind of driving the pattern, right? And the goal is not necessarily to take that bit of movement away. So sometimes you're listening for the effect to said movement through compression.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like sometimes I've done compression on a mix bus or on an instrumental bus that is, or even just that makes everything sound sidechain because it's compressing the entire signal. Yep. Right. And the release time is slow enough where you can kind of hear it pumping, but in a good way.
Yeah. So what I've done in the past, just to kind of like recreate like more of a push, but compressing at the same time, is like parallel it and only get the kick and snare to really punch through that compressor, and then feed that one in a little bit so that it's getting a little more volume through this parallel compression, right? But you're actually maintaining some of that groove by letting the kick and snare bleed through that compression.
Yeah. There you go. So adding movement to a signal.
Yeah.
Adding depth to a mix. Now, this is interesting. I do think that more often than not, people that are still learning about how to properly use compression think that just compressors in general add movement or add depth to a mix. I do think that controlled dynamic range does add depth to the mix, but I do not think that just because you use a compressor, compressors inherently make things sound bigger or wider or deeper.
That's a huge common misconception with like, especially at like, even at an intermediate stages, you'll find people who are like, oh, I'm thinking about buying this piece. Like I'm going to put it on my master bus and it should make my mixes better. It's like, well, in what context? It's like, oh, I heard these have like great width and stuff. It's like, have you tried it though?
Yeah. So I do think I'm going to talk about it. I do think one of the dangers of spending a lot of money buying hardware gear is that feeling that you spent money on it, so you have to use it.
Yeah.
Right? It must be good. You have to use it. And that's one of the dangers. No, not every song sounds good with compression of any type.
Yeah.
And there's many sources and songs where a specific type of compression or setting does make it better, and other settings or other types of compressors do not make it sound better. In general, I do not think compressors naturally make things sound bigger or deeper. It's good use of that compression, not compression by default. All right. Also, continue this list: uncovering nuanced information in an audio signal. That's true. You hear. I mean, it brings out
the smaller details that maybe got hidden behind all those louder ranges.
Great example. You kept talking about snare today. Ghost notes.
Yeah.
You want to hear those ghost notes? You flatten the signal in the dynamic range, and all of a sudden the ghost notes are louder or more similar in volume compared to the main notes.
Yep.
By smashing the big hits, the big snare hits, you bring out the small little nuance. Yeah, that's a great example. De-essing. Now that's a good use of high pass filter.
Yeah. I've noticed. So who was it? There is one unit on the market, and I haven't seen it on another, and I'm having a hard time remembering it. But it has a sidechain filter up to 5K, and I always thought it was weird until like it really made me think like, oh, wait, does the comp 2A?
The Tegler Schwerkraft machine in VCA
has that high of a sidechain?
Yeah, does have a sidechain.
Oh, hell
does
yeah.
have a de-esser.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an option. I mean, this specific unit has 11 different compression modes.
The Manly Vox box also has it, where their de-esser circuit really is just another compressor with a really high sidechain.
There it is. That's all it. I mean, that's all it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all it is. Yeah, so de-essing.
Yeah, because you can only choose one of the two, I believe. Like, you can only enable the compressor or the de-esser.
Yeah, and then the last thing on this list of benefits of a compressor is, quote, gluing a mix together, making it more cohesive. Now, I want to end this episode on talking about what the fuck is glue.
Well, you're talking to the man.
Yeah, today, yeah. Lou, glue is an overused term in the audio industry, but there's a reason why I think it continues to be used.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? And this is something that we constantly try to describe to our interns, our students.
Mm-hmm.
When you hear glue in a mix, what are you hearing? What should people be listening for?
So listen, this is what helped me. So I hope this descriptor helps everybody else. But when things sound very isolated, like when you've recorded drums and there's no room mic, for instance, it's kind of hard to hear all those elements as part of like a room, like you're standing there. Glue style compression helps you kind of bring elements together that may have felt a little more isolated in the mix and make them feel a little more unison, because now they all groove with a similar sense of pump. So because of that, they all feel like they're all kind of part of one unison thing versus all individual elements that are just being compressed. They feel like they're being hugged together.
That's actually a really great description. I something similar. I say that it's like a hamburger that's big and it tastes good all together. But if
then
you
squish it.
you squeeze the hamburger bun
Yeah.
and then it's easier to eat.
Yeah. I was going to say you squeeze the hamburger bun and suddenly it's just a little juicier.
Oh, yeah, the juices come out too.
Yeah. God damn it. I'm supposed to exercise right after this. I can't go for a break.
But I mean, I think that that's the case, right? So it adds a sense of cohesion.
Yeah. Yeah. Like it really is like for me that big like definition of a hug to me. Like you hear the drum set and you hear the bass, but then you add a little bit of compression to like a drum and bass bus, and suddenly they feel a little more in pocket with each other. The compression that they're both going through is in unison and things of that nature. So it feels a little more like they're in the same room with each other.
That's true. That's true. I think that's the point. It
Yeah.
feels like it's in the same room with each other. When we say that, it's like kind of literally, but it's also just in the sense of a sound. Our brains do something when things don't feel the same. I've done this in mixing. Like I mix the drums. I think the drums sound great independently. I mix the strings. I think that sounds great independently. I mix the synths, but it still sounds really separated. You know what I'm talking about? There's like this
like
sensation.
it's a little too perfect.
Yeah, perfect or like it's not
too
cohesive.
isolated.
Yeah. And that's a sensation that is difficult to describe unless you've heard it firsthand. I'm hoping that listeners know what I'm talking about.
You know what? Put a VCA on this podcast.
Yeah. But I'm thinking, is there? I think there might be already. But
Oh my God.
yeah, but I think the point is that glue, the reason why we say glue is because what it does is it takes all the different sections, all the different individual tracks, and it glues them together to feel more cohesive. It feels like there's more teamwork, and it's subtle. It's subtle.
Yeah.
But the instruments aren't working separately. They sound great separately, but they're working together now.
Yeah.
And I don't know why exactly compression, such a technical and practical invention, translates the music in an emotional manner like that.
Yeah.
Because like this glue, this cohesion, this pushing the burger together. What example did you use?
Like if you have like drum and bass, full band recording, right? Guitar, bass, drums, maybe some keys, but everything was so well recorded that it almost sounds isolated. Even if they were in the same room, but sometimes bringing up that little bit of VCA compression on the master bus exaggerates the reverb a little bit, exaggerates the delay a little bit, exaggerates like the room mics a little bit.
Yeah, it feels together. It's interesting that it connects to such an emotional response.
Yeah. And I don't think that was necessarily intended at design right away.
Not. Yeah.
I think they were like, oh, this sounds clean and better. It's cheaper to build. We can put this to market immediately.
Yeah. Yeah, we can make money off of this.
Yeah. Who would have thought?
Wow. But I'm trying to describe this, and I think this is something that we forget, and maybe we close the episode with this, is that all the tools that we have somehow create an emotional response.
Yeah.
And that is the entire point of the tools. Yes, they were made because of a capitalist society. People wanted to solve problems.
Yeah.
And in this case, the problem was dynamic control, too much dynamic range. They thought someone made it in hopes to profit off of it and to add some good to this world, and it did. But then it turned into something interesting, an emotional response. And we use it now to exaggerate and create emotional response to a song, to an audio signal. I think that's one of the most interesting things about mixing is that I think a great mixer doesn't forget that mixing is there to create and exaggerate an emotional response.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why people love music so much. I mean, you watch movies, you watch TV shows, we do this all the time. Sometimes we have music sitting in the background, just in the background, and it creates an ambiance. Music can sometimes be some sort of party, dumb thing just to have fun, but it can also be really complex and create diverse amounts of flavor in the atmosphere. It changes a mood. I mean, think about a scene of a movie with the background music and a scene of a movie without it. It changes the mood completely.
Think of a documentary.
Yeah. It changes the the intention of a scene,
Yeah.
of a moment.
Like if you play a major scale versus a minor scale.
It changes a funeral.
Yeah.
It changes.
Imagine a funeral with
slideshow.
all major scales.
Yeah. But I mean, like you're looking at a slideshow of music in the past, and depending on the music, you have different emotional reaction to it, to the slideshow. Is this a sad thing? Is this a happy thing? Or is this a nostalgic thing? Is this supposed to be soothing, or is it meant to be aggressive?
I mean, music could literally be nostalgic based on tone alone.
Yeah, it's just so interesting that sounds, vibrations in the air can invoke such a cool emotional response in humans. And I think that's part of the reason why I still do music and I love it so much.
Yeah.
And I think that people forget that that's what a compressor is supposed to do. That's what EQs is supposed to do. It's all about that emotional response. And one of the most difficult things that we do as engineers is we are the mediums between technical and emotional.
Yeah.
Which is a very difficult job.
Yeah.
A producer, a songwriter is all emotional.
That's why a lot of times I
almost
ask
all
people
emotional.
what they want as an end result, because some people are looking for a technical end result, some people for an emotional end result, and it doesn't matter if you're an engineer or an artist. Usually it just kind of lands on emotional most times, where they're like, I want it to just feel a little bit better. It's like, what does that mean? It's like, I don't know. Like, I figured you might be able to help with this. It's like, all right, cool. And all my goals at that moment are not anything like, well, if we get a 2-to-1 ratio at a negative 16 threshold.
Yeah, you need to know that.
You need to actually separate yourself from the numbers and put yourself in the pocket of the listener.
That's exactly right. What a great way to end this episode. Just a thoughtful moment there. I do think that the difference between a great engineer and a good engineer is that emotional connection, which is really difficult because in this industry, in order to be a successful engineer or a successful self-employed entrepreneur in general, is oftentimes you'd need to be logical.
Yeah.
You have to kind of...
And part of that logic is knowing when not to do something.
Yeah, or
when
like...
it literally does not serve the song. It serves the ego to do something sometimes, but it doesn't serve the song.
The yang from yin and yang, that logic, that business side, the facts and data side of you have to do well in order to be for the yin to come out, the creative, feminine, chaotic side of you to come out, and you need both. Anyway, sorry, I'm starting to get on a not a transient.
Transient designer, huh?
I'm starting to get on a tangent, so we're going to end this episode up. The challenge for you this week from this episode is to try VCA compression. Try to use too much. This is a great tip to add. If you want to figure out what settings, what attack and release times, high pass filters, etc. sound great, hyper compress the signal. Like do more than 8 dBs of gain reduction as much as you can. Match it with the makeup gain, and then all you have to do is touch the attack and release time. Sometimes you might have to adjust the makeup gain because the more attack you get, the less compression it usually
the more
does.
Release you get,
so hear it out and do extreme amounts of compression, figure out which attack and release sounds the best to you, and maybe that's a good way to practice hearing compression. And then dial it back a shit ton. That's all it is. Maybe this week you try to make things pump intentionally for that movement we talked about.
Instead of going to the gym, get the pump in your studio.
Okay. And that's lastly, I think the most important thing is to remember to stay connected emotionally to that song, and remember that compression is just a tool to do that. Don't get lost in the sauce of the technical stuff. All right. Well, on that note, we hope that you become better mixers. We hope that you find more success with your business, especially as the winter months come. And we say to you, happy mixing, my friends, and stay saucy.